nestled within the craggy peaks of the Caucasus Mountains, where the earth seemed to cradle the heavens, lay a land as ancient as time itself. Armenia, a realm of forgotten kingdoms and whispered legends, stood as a testament to resilience. Its people, weathered but unyielding, lived in the shadow of Mount Ararat, where myths claimed the gods once roamed and mortals dared not tread. In this sacred land, the winds carried more than the scent of wildflowers and pine. They carried the echoes of an ancient prophecy. It was said that within the heart of the mountain, a fire burned eternal, a flame born of Vahagn, the god of war and courage. This was no ordinary fire. It was alive, pulsing with divine energy, waiting for one worthy to claim its power. For centuries, the flame had slumbered, its secrets guarded by shadows and forgotten by most. But legends have a way of stirring in the hearts of the desperate. Era, a young tribal leader with a warrior spirit and a heavy heart, had heard the tales as a child, but they seemed far removed from the struggles of his people. He had no time for myths when marauders threatened the borders and whispers of betrayal festered within. Yet, the dreams began vivid and unrelenting. Each night, a woman with piercing eyes and a crown of flames beckoned him to Mount Ararat. "Seek the fire," she would whisper, her voice both a comfort and a command, "or lose everything." When the dreams became too much to bear, Era knew he could no longer ignore them. He could feel the pulse of something ancient stirring within him, a call to arms, a call to destiny. And so, with his tribe on the brink of destruction, he prepared to journey into the unknown, to seek the eternal flame and the truth of his own bloodline. Little did Era know, the trials ahead would test not only his strength but his very soul. For the fire did not merely grant power, it demanded a price. The moon hung low over the Armenian Highlands, casting a silvery glow across the jagged peaks and deep valleys. Era stood at the edge of his village, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of Mount Ararat. Its twin peaks loomed like watchful sentinels, shrouded in an aura of mysticism that no man could fully comprehend. Tonight, the mountain called to him with an urgency that felt almost alive, as if it breathed with the pulse of the land itself. The wind carried with it the familiar sense of his home. The sweet aroma of wildflowers mingled with the smoky tang of hearth fires. But there was another scent beneath it all. Faint yet unmistakable, the iron tang of blood. The marauders had struck again, attacking the outlying farms and leaving devastation in their wake. Era's people were skilled fighters, but they were outnumbered, and their strength was waning. "Era," came a voice behind him. He turned to see Taran, his most trusted warrior and childhood friend. Taran's face was lined with weariness, his dark eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. "The council awaits your decision. We must act soon, or the village won't survive another raid." Era nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. For weeks, he'd been haunted by strange dreams, visions of fire and shadow, of a woman with eyes like molten gold. She stood atop Mount Ararat, her hand outstretched, beckoning him toward the peak. "Seek the fire," she'd whispered, her voice echoing in his mind long after he awoke. "Or lose everything." He'd dismissed the dreams at first, attributing them to the stress of leadership and the ever-present threat of invasion. But the visions had grown more vivid, more insistent, until they felt less like dreams and more like memories of a life he'd never lived. The woman's voice was now a constant presence in his thoughts, a siren's call he could no longer ignore. "Taran," Era said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. "Prepare the warriors. We'll defend the village as we always have. But there's something I must do first." Taran frowned, his concern evident. "What are you planning?" Era hesitated, unsure how to explain the pull he felt toward the mountain. "Finally," he said, "there's an ancient legend about Mount Ararat, a flame that burns eternal, said to be a gift from the god Vahagn himself. If it exists, it might be the key to saving our people." Taran's frown deepened. "Era, that's just a story. No one has seen this flame in generations. Even if it's real, the mountain is treacherous. And the temple, it's forbidden. Forbidden or not, it's our only chance. Era said firmly. The invaders won't stop until they've taken everything from us. I won't let that happen. Reluctantly, Terran nodded. Very well, but promise me you'll be careful. We can't afford to lose you. Era. Era placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. I'll return. I swear it. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Era set out for Mount Ararat, leaving his village behind. The journey was long and arduous, the rugged terrain testing his endurance at every step. But Era pressed on, driven by the urgency of his dreams and the weight of his people's survival. Along the way, he encountered traces of the ancient kingdom that had once ruled these lands. Ruined fortresses and weathered statues lay scattered across the highlands, their stone faces worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Era paused at one such site, a crumbling temple dedicated to Vahagn. The god of war and courage was depicted with flames in his hair and a serpent in his grasp, his eyes blazing with divine fury. Kneeling before the statue, Era whispered a prayer. Vahagn, if you still watch over these lands, guide me. Show me the way to your flame. The air around him seemed to shift, the wind carrying a faint whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. Though he couldn't make out the words, Era felt a renewed sense of purpose. He rose and continued his ascent, the path growing steeper and more treacherous with each step. By nightfall, he reached a dense forest at the base of the mountain. The trees stood tall and ancient, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. As Era ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and an eerie silence enveloped him. The only sound was the crunch of his boots on the forest floor. It was here that he encountered Anahit, the seer. She appeared seemingly out of nowhere, her form shrouded in a cloak of raven feathers. Her eyes, sharp and penetrating, seemed to see straight into Era's soul. "You seek the flame," she said, her voice a soft murmur that carried an air of authority. It wasn't a question. Era nodded, wary but determined. "I do. Can you help me find it?" Anahit regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "The flame is not easily claimed. It burns for the worthy, and the worthy alone. To reach it, you must face trials that will test your heart, your mind, and your spirit. Are you prepared for what lies ahead?" "I am," Era said without hesitation. The seer's lips curved into a faint smile. "Very well. Follow me." She led him through the forest to a hidden path that wound its way up the mountain. As they walked, Anahit told him of the prophecy. A chosen one of royal blood who would awaken the flame and wield its power to unite the tribes of Armenia. "Your bloodline carries the legacy of kings," she said. "But the flame demands more than noble birth. It seeks courage, sacrifice, and a heart free of doubt." Era listened intently, her words igniting a spark of hope within him. He thought of his people, of their suffering and their resilience. If the flame could truly save them, he would endure any trial to claim it. As the first rays of dawn broke through the forest canopy, they reached the entrance to the temple. The structure was carved directly into the mountainside, its massive stone doors adorned with intricate carvings of flames and serpents. Anahit turned to Era, her expression grave. "This is where I leave you," she said. "Beyond these doors lie the trials. Remember, the flame does not grant power lightly. You must prove yourself worthy." Era nodded, his resolve firm. "Thank you, Anahit, for everything." She gave him a nod of acknowledgement before disappearing into the forest, leaving Era alone before the temple. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into the darkness beyond, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. Inside, the air was thick and still, the only light coming from the faint glow of runes etched into the walls. As Era ventured deeper, the temperature dropped, and a sense of foreboding settled over him. He knew he was not alone. Whispers echoed through the chamber, faint and indistinct, like the voices of the dead. Shadows danced along the walls, their movements unnatural and unsettling. Era gripped his sword tightly, every muscle in his body tense. He had entered the realm of the unknown, and there was no turning back. The temple doors groaned shut behind Era, sealing him in darkness. For a moment, he stood still, letting his eyes adjust to the faint luminescence of the runes that lined the walls. They pulsed like the heartbeat of the mountain itself, their glow reflecting in the polished blade of his sword. The air was heavy, laden with the scent of damp stone and the faint tang of something metallic. He tightened his grip on the hilt, his senses sharp, as he ventured deeper into the labyrinth of shadows. The whispers that had followed him from the entrance grew louder, their ethereal cadence weaving an unrelenting tapestry of doubt. They called his name, hissed secrets he did not understand, and laughed with a malice that made his skin crawl. Yet Era pressed on, his resolve a fragile ember against the gale of the unknown. The first chamber he entered was vast, its high ceilings lost to darkness. In the center stood a pool of water, perfectly still, reflecting the glowing runes in its depths. Across the pool, a figure emerged from the shadows. At first, Era thought it to be a reflection, but as it stepped closer, he realized it was no illusion. The figure was himself, or rather, a darkened version of himself. Its eyes glowed with the same molten gold as the woman in his dreams, and its lips curled into a cruel smile. "Who are you?" Era demanded, his voice echoing in the chamber. The doppelganger chuckled, a low and menacing sound. "I am you," it said. "Every fear, every doubt, every failure you've ever buried. And I am here to test your worth." Era raised his sword, the steel catching the faint light of the runes. "I will not falter." The shadow Era laughed, drawing its own blade from the ether. "We shall see." The fight was unlike any Era had faced before. Every strike he made was met with equal force. Every maneuver anticipated as though his opponent could read his thoughts. The doppelganger moved with a fluid grace, the strikes precise and unrelenting. Era soon found himself on the defensive, his strength waning as the whispers grew louder, feeding his doubts. "You are not worthy," the whispers chanted. "You will fail." But as the doppelganger pressed its advantage, Era's mind flashed to his village, to the faces of his people. He thought of Terran, of the children playing in the fields, of the elders sharing stories by the fire. He thought of the marauders and the destruction they had wrought. The ember of his resolve flared, burning away the doubt that threatened to consume him. "I am Era," he growled, his voice cutting through the whispers like a blade. "Leader of my people, protector of these lands. And I will not yield." With a surge of strength, Era drove his sword forward, piercing the shadow through the heart. The doppelganger let out a wail that shook the chamber, its form dissolving into tendrils of smoke that dissipated into the air. The whispers fell silent, and the pool of water rippled as if in acknowledgement of his victory. Exhausted but triumphant, Era knelt by the pool, the surface now clear and calm. Within its depths, he saw visions of the past, the ancient kingdom of Urartu in all its glory, its people thriving under the protection of the eternal flame. He saw kings and warriors, their eyes glowing with the same golden fire, wielding its power to unite the tribes and repel invaders. And he saw the flame itself, a pulsating beacon of divine energy, waiting for the worthy to claim it. But the visions grew darker. He saw betrayal, bloodshed, and the flame extinguished by unworthy hands. The kingdom fell, his people scattered, and the flame was hidden away, guarded by the trials that now stood between him and his destiny. "You have passed the first trial," came a voice, echoing through the chamber. Era turned to see Anahit, her form shimmering as if she were not truly there. "But the path ahead will not be so easily conquered." Era rose to his feet, his resolve stronger than ever. "Tell me what I must do." Anahit nodded, her expression grave. "The flame demands 3 trials. The trial of shadows, which you have faced and overcome, the trial of sacrifice, where you must surrender what you hold most dear, and the trial of truth, where you will face the deepest secrets of your heart. Only then will the flame reveal itself to you. Era's jaw tightened. And if I fail? Then the flame will remain hidden, and your people will perish. The weight of her words settled heavily on Era's shoulders, but he refused to let it deter him. I will not fail, he said, his voice firm. For my people, for the future of these lands, I will endure whatever trials lie ahead. Anahit's form began to fade, her voice echoing as she disappeared. Then step forward, Era, and face the trial of sacrifice. The runes along the walls flared brightly, illuminating a doorway that had not been there before. Era stepped through, leaving the chamber behind. The whispers were gone, replaced by a profound silence that seemed to press against his ears. The path ahead was steep and narrow, winding its way up the mountain, but Era's steps were steady, his heart resolute. As he ascended, the memories of the visions he'd seen lingered in his mind. The glory of Urartu, the power of the flame, and the tragedy of its fall. He thought of the prophecy Anahit had spoken of, the legacy of kings that ran through his veins. It was a heavy burden, but one he was determined to bear. At last, he reached the second chamber, its entrance marked by a pair of stone serpents coiled around a blazing torch. The air here was warmer, the faint scent of burning wood mingling with the mountain breeze. Era stepped inside, his grip tightening on his sword as he prepared to face the next trial. The second chamber loomed ahead, an intimidating expanse of shadow and fire. Era hesitated at the threshold, his breath caught in his chest as he absorbed the weight of the task before him. The stone serpents coiled around the blazing torch flanked the entrance, their unblinking eyes seeming to watch his every move. He took a step forward, crossing into the chamber, and immediately the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavy, pressing against his skin like an invisible force, and the torchlight dimmed until it cast only the faintest glow. The darkness inside was alive. It seemed to pulse and shift, shapes forming and dissolving at the edges of his vision. The whispers that had accompanied him earlier returned, louder and more insistent, filling his mind with doubt and fear. You should turn back. One voice hissed. This path will destroy you. Your people are lost already. Another taunted. Why waste your life for them? Era clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on his sword. I will not falter, he said aloud, forcing his voice to steady. The sound echoed in the vast chamber, a small but defiant declaration against the oppressive shadows. As he moved further into the room, the shadows coalesced into forms. At first, they were vague and indistinct, little more than wisps of darkness. But as Era approached the center of the chamber, the shapes solidified into figures he recognized. His heart clenched as he saw his parents, their faces etched with grief and disappointment. You failed us, Era, his father's shadow said, his voice heavy with sorrow. You were supposed to protect your family. You left us to die, his mother's shadow added, her tone accusatory. Why didn't you save us? Era's breath hitched. The memories flooded back unbidden. The night his village was attacked when he was just a boy, the flames consuming their home as he fled into the woods. He'd survived, but his parents hadn't. The guilt had haunted him ever since, a wound that never fully healed. It wasn't my fault, he whispered, though his voice wavered with doubt. I was just a child. The shadows advanced, their forms growing larger and more menacing. You've failed everyone you've ever loved, they said in unison. What makes you think you can succeed now? Era stumbled back, the weight of their words threatening to crush him. But then he remembered the seer's prophecy and the faces of his people, their hope and trust placed squarely on his shoulders. He couldn't let the past define him. I can succeed because I must, he said, his voice rising with determination. I may have failed before, but that doesn't mean I will fail again. My people depend on me, and I will not let them down." As he spoke, the shadows began to waver, their forms flickering like candle flames in the wind. Era stepped forward, his sword raised, and swung at the closest shadow. His blade passed through it harmlessly, but the act itself seemed to weaken the figure. It dissolved into nothingness, and Era felt a surge of strength. "You have no power over me," he declared, his voice ringing through the chamber. One by one, he confronted the shadows, each swing of his sword dispelling them further. With each victory, the whispers grew fainter, and the oppressive darkness began to lift. Finally, he reached the center of the chamber, where a single shadow remained. It was larger than the others, its form shifting and swirling as if it were made of smoke. Era recognized it immediately. It was himself, or rather, the worst version of himself. Every failure, every doubt, every fear given form. "You think you can escape me?" the shadow said, its voice a distorted echo of his own. "I am you. I will always be with you." Era stared at the shadow, his jaw set. "You're right," he said. "You are a part of me, but you do not define me. I choose who I am, not my fears or my failures." The shadow lunged at him, its smoky tendrils reaching out to envelop him. Era raised his sword and plunged it into the heart of the darkness. The shadow let out a piercing shriek, the sound reverberating through the chamber as it dissolved into nothingness. The room fell silent, the whispers gone, the shadows banished. In the center of the chamber, where the shadow had stood, a pedestal rose from the floor. On it lay a small, glowing ember, pulsing with a warm golden light. Era approached cautiously, his breath catching as he realized what it was. A fragment of the eternal flame. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the ember. A surge of warmth spread through him, filling him with a sense of purpose and clarity he had never known. The ember fused into his palm, leaving behind a faint golden mark. Era knew this was only the beginning of his journey, but he felt stronger, more resolved than ever. As he exited the chamber, the stone serpents at the entrance seemed to nod in approval. The next trial awaited, but Era was ready. He had faced his shadows and emerged victorious. Now, he would face whatever else the mountain had in store for him. The mountain air grew colder as Era descended from the chamber of shadows, the faint glow of the golden mark on his palm hidden beneath his cloak. The weight of his trials pressed heavily on him, but so did the ember's warmth, a constant reminder of the strength he had gained. The journey to the eternal flame was far from over, and he knew that the most difficult tests lay ahead. Yet, as he emerged onto a rocky outcropping overlooking the highlands, a sense of dread gripped his heart. In the distance, columns of smoke rose from the direction of his village. Era's breath caught, his mind racing. He could almost hear the cries of his people, the clash of steel, and the chaos of battle carried on the wind. The marauders had come. Without hesitation, he began his descent, his legs moving faster than his thoughts. Each step down the jagged slopes of Mount Ararat felt like an eternity. Every moment lost a chance to save his people. The golden mark on his palm burned faintly, as if urging him onward. By the time Era reached the outskirts of the village, the sun had begun to set, casting a fiery glow over the smoldering ruins. The marauders were everywhere, their war cries filling the air as they looted and burned. Villagers fought desperately to defend their homes, armed with whatever they could find, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Era's heart sank at the sight of Terran, his trusted friend, leading a group of defenders against a band of heavily armed invaders. "Terran!" Era shouted, charging into the fray. His sword flashed in the dying light as he cut through the marauders, his movements fueled by a mixture of rage and desperation. Terran turned at the sound of his name, relief flickering across his bloodied face. "Era!" he called back. "We're holding them off, but barely. They've set fire to the granaries and taken the children hostage. We need—" Terran's words were cut short as a marauder lunged at him, Era stepped in, his blade slicing through the attacker with precision. He pulled Terran back, his voice firm. "We'll drive them out. Gather everyone who can fight. We'll make our stand at the village square." Terran nodded, his determination renewed. "What about the children?" Era's jaw tightened. "I'll find them. Go!" As Terran rallied the defenders, Era moved swiftly through the chaos, his eyes scanning the smoke-filled streets for any sign of the hostages. The village he had sworn to protect was unrecognizable, its once vibrant life reduced to ash and ruin. Each cry for help, each fallen figure, stoked the fire within him, the ember in his palm pulsing in response. He found the children in the old chapel at the edge of the village, their terrified faces lit by the flickering flames of torches carried by their captors. A group of marauders had barricaded the doors, laughing cruelly as they taunted their captives. Era crept closer, his movements silent, his mind focused. He would not fail them. With a sudden burst of speed, he attacked, his sword a blur of steel. The marauders were caught off guard, their laughter turning to screams as Era cut them down one by one. The last of them fell, and Era turned to the children, his voice gentle but urgent. "It's safe now. Follow me." The children hesitated, their fear paralyzing them, but Era extended his hand, the golden mark on his palm glowing softly. The light seemed to calm them, and one by one, they stepped forward, leading them through the burning village. Era felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would protect them, no matter the cost. By the time he reached the square, the defenders had regrouped, their numbers bolstered by villagers who had joined the fight. The marauders, realizing they were losing their advantage, began to retreat. Era stood at the forefront, his sword raised high, the golden mark on his palm shining like a beacon. "This is our land," he shouted, his voice carrying over the battlefield. "Our home, and we will not let it fall to those who seek to destroy it." The defenders roared in response, their courage reignited. They pushed the marauders back, their attacks relentless. By the time the last of the invaders fled into the darkness, the village was scarred but still standing. Era stood in the center of the square, his chest heaving, his sword slick with blood. Around him, the villagers began to gather, their expressions a mixture of relief and gratitude. Terran approached, his face weary but triumphant. "We did it," he said, clapping Era on the shoulder. "We drove them out." Era nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. The ember in his palm burned faintly, a reminder that his journey was not yet complete. He had saved his people for now, but the threat would return. The only way to ensure their safety was to claim the eternal flame and wield its power. "This is only the beginning," Era said, his voice low but resolute. "The flame still waits, and I must finish what I started." As the villagers began to rebuild, Era prepared to return to the mountain. His people needed him, but so did the prophecy. The invaders had been defeated, but the true battle was yet to come. The path to the final chamber of the eternal flame was shrouded in an eerie stillness. Era could feel the weight of his journey pressing down on him as he ascended the last stretch of Mount Ararat. The faint glow of the golden mark on his palm pulsed steadily, guiding him forward through the darkened halls of the ancient temple. Each step felt heavier than the last, but the thought of his people, their hopes, their survival pushed him onward. At last, he reached the heart of the temple. The chamber was vast and circular, its domed ceiling adorned with carvings of flames and stars. In the center stood a pedestal, upon which a brilliant, living flame danced and flickered. Its light bathed the room in a golden glow, illuminating the intricate runes etched into the walls and floor. Era felt his breath catch at the sight of the flame. This was the power he had sought, the divine gift of Vahagn, the eternal flame. But he was not alone. A shadow moved at the edge of the chamber. Era's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword as a figure stepped into the light. It was Anahit, the seer who had guided him on his journey. Yet, there was something different about her now. Her eyes, once sharp and knowing, glowed with an otherworldly light, and her voice echoed with a duality that was both human and divine. "Era," she said, her tone both warm and commanding. "You have come far, and your trials have proven your strength, your resolve, and your heart. But the final test remains. The flame will not yield its power lightly. Are you prepared to face the truth of your soul?" Era nodded, though his heart pounded in his chest. "I am ready." Anahit stepped aside, her form dissolving into shimmering light as she gestured toward the flame. "Then step forward, and let the flame judge you." Era approached the pedestal, the heat of the flame intensifying with each step. As he drew closer, the golden mark on his palm began to burn, its light merging with that of the flame. The whispers he had silenced during his earlier trials returned, louder and more insistent, swirling around him like a storm. "You are not worthy," they hissed. "You will fail. You will burn." But Era stood firm. He had faced these doubts before, and he would not let them consume him now. He reached out, his hand trembling, and plunged it into the heart of the flame. The world exploded into light and heat. Era's vision blurred as the flame engulfed him, its energy surging through his body and mind. He saw visions, memories of his life, his failures, his triumphs. He saw his people, their faces filled with hope and fear. And he saw the ancient kings of Urartu, their eyes blazing with the same golden fire that now consumed him. And then he saw the truth. The flame was not merely a source of power. It was a mirror, reflecting the essence of the one who sought it. Era saw his fears, his doubts, and his flaws laid bare. But he also saw his strength, his courage, and his unwavering love for his people. The flame did not demand perfection. It demanded honesty. It demanded sacrifice. "What will you give?" The flame's voice echoed in his mind. "What will you surrender for the power to protect your people?" Era's mind raced. He thought of his life, his dreams, his desire to lead a peaceful existence. And then he thought of the faces of the children he had saved, the villagers who had fought beside him, and the generations yet to come. He knew what he had to do. "I give myself," he said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "My life, my soul, my destiny, all of it, for them." The flame roared in response, its light filling the chamber as it accepted his sacrifice. The golden mark on Era's palm spread, engulfing his entire body in a radiant glow. The heat subsided, replaced by a profound sense of peace. When the light faded, Era stood transformed. The golden fire now burned within him, a part of his very being. He turned to leave the chamber, his steps lighter, his purpose clear. As he emerged from the temple, the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, casting a warm glow over the highlands. Era descended the mountain, the flame within him guiding his way. When he returned to the village, the people gathered around him, their expressions a mix of awe and hope. Terran stepped forward, his eyes widening as he took in the golden light that seemed to emanate from Era. "Era," he said, his voice filled with wonder. You did it." Era nodded, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his people. "The flame is ours once more," he said, "and with its power, we will rebuild. We will protect our home and our future. Together." The villagers erupted into cheers, their voices rising like a song of triumph. Era felt a deep sense of fulfillment, but he knew his work was far from over. The flame was not a weapon to be wielded lightly. It was a responsibility, a covenant with the land and its people. He would honor it, just as the kings of old had before him. As the sun rose higher, bathing the village in its golden light, Era stood at the center of his people, the chosen flame-bearer of the Armenian Highlands. The eternal flame burned within him, a beacon of hope and unity that would guide them into a brighter future.